Hello, everyone. We are continuing working through the book of 1 Samuel. And as we do so, we're going to be trying to get through 3 chapters today, chapters 18, 19, and 20. And so we're going to dive right in because there's some good stuff here, a lot of information that's going to get processed. But I think we're going to continue to see just these vast differences between these two kings, between David and Saul. But as we do so, we're also going to see that Saul is kind of the outlier. That while Saul has this hatred and this fear of David, everybody else, frankly, loves David. And that starts with this great friendship that we all know well, the friendship, the love that was between David and Jonathan. And I'll admit to stealing this image from Brad Allis. He used this just the other week during our Generate retreat. But it's this painting of David and Jonathan, the young David actually still carrying the head of Goliath. Certainly not how this image, I think, typically appears in our mind, but I think we'll see that it is where it happens in the timeline. So, chapter 18, verse 1. As soon as David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. I feel like it's at least worth mentioning if you read about this friendship, this great love that Jonathan and David had for one another. In today's world, you'll often hear at least some insinuation, perhaps, that this wasn't exactly a chaste relationship. Personally, I feel like that's reading far too much into the text. There's no indication of that really throughout the history of the church. No church fathers, no leaders of the church. That's never really been a consideration. As we look at this particular narrative, as we see Jonathan giving his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt, what we really see him doing here is just bestowing this great honor on David as a part of this covenant. And I think, if anything, there's a political aspect to this. If you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, when Saul had lost the throne, this was the second time that he had been rebuked and said that God is going to abandon you because you have abandoned his way. Saul reaches out and he tears Samuel's ma'il, his robe. And Samuel says, just as you have torn my ma'il, the kingdom has been torn from you and it will be given to someone greater than you. Here we see the crowned prince, the heir to the throne, Jonathan, taking his ma'il, same word, and offering it to David. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Jonathan is like, oh, this is the future king. This is where it's got to go. This is way too early in the story, I think, for us to assume that that's what's happening. But I do think God is intentionally using this moment to point us to the fact that, hey, Jonathan is going to be giving his throne to David. David is going to be the one that receives that ma'il, that torn kingdom. It's going to be David's. And really, as we look at this, again, I've read some articles or some commentaries that suggest, well, look at how the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. That can only possibly be talking about a romantic relationship. But those exact words, actually, the wording is exactly the same as the love that Jacob has for his son Benjamin. After Joseph dies, it talks about how Jacob, Israel, his soul is knit to his son Benjamin, and he loves him as his own soul. That same wording there is used as a father to a son. And maybe there actually is even some aspect here. We're not sure how much older than David Jonathan would be. Maybe there is some aspect where Jonathan is saying, I'm taking you under my wing. I'm going to treat you as if you were my son. Certainly, as we continue looking at these chapters, we're going to see that this covenant has lasting family implications. David and Jonathan are basically swearing to each other that they're going to look out for one another's families no matter what. It's a beautiful friendship, a beautiful relationship. I think it's an image of what our friendships ought to look like, where we love our friends as if they were our very family. But anyway, notice again, too, everyone likes David, except for what we're going to read next. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have only ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. So we see here really the start of Saul's deep jealousy for David. And actually, it's probably a misunderstanding. This kind of formula, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s, his thousands and his myriads. This is just kind of a standard poetic formula in the life of Israel. They're not necessarily saying that David is greater. In fact, some commentators have suggested that placing Saul first gives Saul the honor, and David is then kind of the secondary thought of the piece, if that makes sense. But Saul hears it, and he takes extreme offense. I don't think this is what the women were intending as they were singing this song. I think they're celebrating Saul's triumphant return as king, and they're celebrating this new hero in Israel, David. This is a good thing. It's a joyous celebration. They're not trying to get their shots in on Saul here. They really are trying to rejoice and celebrate, but Saul is the one who takes it personally. And perhaps that's a helpful reminder for us that oftentimes we're the ones that kind of influence our own frustration, that oftentimes we're the ones who cause offense within ourselves. You often hear this, you're the one that can control your emotions, right? I remember hearing that as a kid. Well, who made you angry? Well, technically, you made yourself angry. No one made you angry. I don't know that that's entirely accurate. Certainly, situations around us affect us. They affect our emotions. But we see here that Saul's frustration, Saul's worry, is a sin of his own making. And in fact, as he eyes David from that day on, now I think we are seeing Saul thinks David might be the future king. That's why he's saying, what else can he have but the kingdom? He's worried that this David is going to be a threat to his throne, that this David is the one who's going to end his dynasty. In verse 10, we see the results of this jealousy. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall, but David evaded him twice. I think this image is kind of striking. You have David bearing his harp, Saul bearing his spear. We see kind of the unfairness of this fight, right? Saul is using his spear. He's trying to pin David up against the wall to murder him. Now, partially under the influence of the spirit, but remember, the spirit's only there because Saul has kind of let it in. And so we see Saul twice going after David with his spear, and David evades him both times. Verse 12, then Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. So all this is saying is that Saul is jealous, he's worried about David, and so what does he do? He puts him in charge of the army. He sends him out, he says, go fight on my behalf, and David does it, and God just blesses David. David has this spirit of God, but the Lord has departed from Saul, and so wherever David goes, he has success. And Saul just gets more and more worried, more and more anxious, more and more fearful of this David, this man with the Spirit of the Lord. But all Israel and Judah love David. I think this is why, if we go back to chapter 16, this is why I said last week that I don't think that it's Saul that loves David greatly. It's David that loves Saul greatly when they first meet each other. because out of everyone in the book, Saul is the only one that repeatedly finds fault, even though it's not there, in his servant David. Verse 17, Then Saul said to David, Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So Saul comes up with this idea, and again, we've kind of seen it already in chapter 18. He wants David to go out and be in charge of the troops. That way, the Philistines are fighting David. Saul doesn't have to worry about it. The Philistines are going to take him down at some point. Fight enough battles, eventually you'll lose. But I think it's interesting, too. We're actually already seeing that Saul has kind of gone back on a promise that he has made. If we go back to 1 Samuel 17, to the battle between the Philistine, between Goliath and David, David finds out that the person who challenges and defeats Goliath has been promised 3 things by King Saul. He's been promised great riches. He's been promised the king's elder daughter in marriage. And he's been promised no taxation for his family. Well, right here we're seeing that second promise, the eldest daughter in marriage, that promise hasn't been fulfilled. In fact, Saul says, okay, you can marry my daughter, but before you do, you also have to do this. You have to go fight my battles on my behalf. Saul's kind of moving the goalposts here. He's not fulfilling his promise to the rightful champion, to the person who has defeated Goliath. And David said to Saul, Who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? I don't want to say this is fake humility, because I don't think that's true. But as we look at Israelite culture, or just kind of Middle East culture, Near East culture, we repeatedly see this kind of formulaic humility, let's call it that, where these people express these humble statements but aren't really saying, I don't want this gift. They're saying they don't deserve it, but they're going to accept it anyway. So for me, I'm kind of picturing like an Oscar recipient, someone who goes up there and gives a speech and say, oh man, there were so many worthy actors or actresses, I wasn't sure that I deserved this, but I'm going to take it anyway, right? That's kind of what we see happening here. Verse 19, But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite for the wife. In some respects, then, I think we're meant to see a parallel here between Jacob, between Israel himself, and his marriage. If you recall correctly, Jacob, when he sees Rachel, is smitten with her and says, I want to marry her. I'm going to work 7 years for you, Uncle Laban, and then I will get to marry Rachel. Well, when those 7 years pass, even though Jacob has fulfilled the price that was agreed upon, he's given Leah instead of Rachel for his wife. Here we see Saul kind of doing a similar thing. He uses his daughter as a means to try and humiliate David and gives her to another man. Even though David has been promised this elder daughter in marriage, just like you see on the screen, he does not receive that promise. That wife is given to another man, to Adriel. Verse 20, though, Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. All right, so Saul hears, okay, my other daughter also loves David. I can use this to my advantage. Saul thought, let me give her to him so that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Notice again, Saul does not have David's best interest in mind in any of this. He's really trying to manipulate this situation to get David hurt. Therefore, Saul said to David a second time, You shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David in private and say, Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So he's kind of even manipulating the situation even more. Okay, he might not accept it from me, but maybe he'll accept it from my servants. And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? Now, again, I think we see some of that kind of formulaic humility here. But also notice he calls himself a poor man. Another one of those promises had been great riches. If we're taking David's words, at least at mostly face value, where are those riches that were promised? Not only has Saul abandoned the eldest daughter in marriage, that aspect of the promise, He's abandoned the richest portion, at least it appears. I obviously can't follow through on if there was taxation of his family or not. That's not given to us in Scripture. But isn't it interesting that these three things that Saul has promised to whoever defeats Goliath, he didn't know it would be David. He's backed away from those things. He's not going to offer them to David. And the servants of Saul told him thus, and so did David speak. So the servants go back and say, look, he doesn't have money. He can't pay a bride price. And so Saul said, she sells seashells. Thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. And so now Saul offers up another bride price, specifically 100 Philistine foreskins. This is significant because some of the other surrounding nations, particularly the ones that would more be considered Middle Eastern, would have practiced circumcision as well. But anyone from like a Greek background, the Philistines would have probably found their way over from Greece at some point, or at least that's our best guess as a seafaring people. They would not have practiced circumcision, so the giving of the foreskins delineates that these were actually Philistines that were killed. And David sees the bride price and he doubles it. He brings back 200 instead of just 100, perhaps to ensure that this bride price that he pays is accepted, and so that he receives Michal as a wife. But we find out that this also kind of backfires on Saul. Verse 28, but when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. David just continues to grow in stature within the surrounding community. He continues to prove himself to be a worthy king. And again, isn't it interesting? Saul should be the one out leading Israel into battle. But who is? David, the man after God's own heart. Verse 19, this just continues to escalate. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. So Jonathan is fulfilling his end of the covenant. He's taking care of David here. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. Jonathan points out, look, everything that David has been doing has been to your benefit. David is looking out for you. David has your best interest in mind. He hasn't sinned against you. There's no need to be afraid of him. Verse 5, for he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So Jonathan had found out about a plot to kill David, and had kind of gotten him to safety before going to his father and convincing him to stop this plot. That there's absolutely no reason to be considering harming David. David hasn't sinned against Saul. He's not going to. He's a good guy. Look at all the things he's done for you. If he wanted to hurt you, he already could have. And he hasn't. So let's bring him back. They bring back David. He's in the king's presence again. And there was war again, verse 8. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow so that they fled before him. Then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul that he struck the spear into the wall. and David fled and escaped that night. Now, we don't know how quickly this particular account happens after what we've just heard, that Saul has welcomed David back in with open arms. I'd have to imagine it's pretty soon. Just with what we know about Saul, Saul is just obsessive over David. It's starting now, but we're just going to see it throughout the rest of 1 Samuel. Saul is just obsessed with his fear for David, for what David will do to him, to his kingly line. And so as we're looking at this then, it kind of takes us back to this image again, right? Saul grabs his spear while David is playing the lyre and tries to pin him to the wall. But David escapes. But Saul, verse 11, sent messengers to David's house to watch him that he might kill him in the morning. So Saul sends messengers out. David escapes into the darkness, into the night, and Saul sends messengers, or kind of a reconnaissance team, his stakeout, to double check and make sure that David is staying in his house so that in the morning he can kill him. But, verse 12, so Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. So what we have here, we have this teraphim that Michal is using. These typically weren't very big. In our reading, it kind of sounds like it may have just been a singular one, that there may have just been a large enough household idol that Michal could put it in the bed and it would look passably like a human. There's kind of some flaws with that in my mind, though, because in order to move something stone like that, or wood, which would be the two general materials that these would be made out of, that's a lot of weight to move for a life-size sculpture, like one of these little stone ones. I think what's more likely is that she had a number of them, and she hid that number of them. Teraphim is plural, although it appears in the plural even when it's singular. Don't ask why. I couldn't tell you the answer. So it's possible that she was hiding them, because obviously we wouldn't see David as using these teraphim. He would see this as idolatry. I mean, he's a man after God's own heart. This is something that God has commanded his people not to do. I think it's probable that Michal was hiding these in her house and now had this opportunity to use them. There could actually even be a parallel, again, between Michal and Rachel, Jacob's second wife. If you'll recall correctly, back in the book of Genesis, when Jacob flees Laban, his uncle, Rachel steals a teraphim and hides it. And I think perhaps barrenness might have something to do with this, that these two women who were barren, Michal and Rachel, at least at the time where we see these idols being used, perhaps saw these little idols as just kind of an insurance policy. As, okay, I'm having difficulty getting pregnant, I'm having difficulty becoming a mom, I'm going to turn to these because nothing else seems to be working. And so she hid them from her husband, just like Rachel hid hers actually from Jacob all those years ago. Jacob had no idea that Rachel had took those. All right. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. This probably means that Michal and David's house is in the wall. Otherwise, lowering him outside the window wouldn't really help. If you just lowered him outside the window, the guards would still see him. So I think it's reasonable to think that David and Michal's house is situated in the city wall. And so they have him climb over that city wall to get to the outside, to further aid his escape. Verse 13, Michal took an image, a teraphim, and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, and when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. So they come and they see him sick there, and they're not going to take him. So Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with the pillow of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me thus and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Now David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. And it was told Saul, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So David has fled to Ramah with Samuel, and as he has done so, Saul has sent out a company of guards, a company of soldiers to come out and take him, to return him to Saul so that Saul might have him put to death. And as they do so, they come across this company of prophets with Samuel at their head who is prophesying, and they too begin to prophesy. Their mission to grab David is thwarted as they begin to prophesy. Verse 21, when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. So Saul tries this 3 times, and every time the messengers he sent end up prophesying alongside this company of prophets. So then he himself, verse 22, went to Ramah, and came to the great well that is in Secu. And he asked, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they are at Naioth and Ramah. And he went there to Naioth and Ramah. And the Spirit of God came upon him also, and as he went he prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, as Saul also among the prophets. And so as we hear these words, I think we find ourselves kind of being drawn back to 1 Samuel chapter 10, when the Spirit of God initially comes upon Saul. He goes out and he prophesies, and this very same question is asked, is Saul also among the prophets? And that first time, it's because the Spirit of God is upon him, and he's doing what the Spirit of God has commanded, what Samuel has said will take place. And now we see this prophecy, including his nakedness, to his great shame. This man who is supposed to be a faithful king is anything but, pursuing the wrongful death of one of his faithful servants. Chapter 20. Then David fled from Naioth and Ramah, and came and said before Jonathan, what have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? So David leaves Naioth and Ramah, where Samuel is, and he goes back and talks to Jonathan. Jonathan, what have I done? Maybe you can picture yourself doing this as well, saying, well, I feel like I haven't done anything wrong. Why is this person so upset with me? And there's actually some righteousness, I think, in that thought, in wondering, have I caused offense in some way that I just was unaware of? We do that all the time. We sin all the time and are unaware of it. And so I think it is right, if someone is mad at us, to first consider, have we ourselves done something wrong? Let's not be the first one to point the finger and say, well, this is all them. Let's actually look at ourselves first, like David does here. And Jonathan said to him, far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. So Jonathan says, whoa, wait a minute. My dad isn't seeking to kill you. We talked about this last chapter. He was, and I stopped him, and now it's all good. And he hasn't brought it up again. Everything's awesome. But David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. So David says to Jonathan, he's hiding it from you because he knows that you care about me. He knows how good of friends we are, and he knows that you will either put a stop to it or help me. This is real. He even takes an oath here. As the Lord lives, and as I live, as your soul lives, your father is out to get me. Then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. So Jonathan is sticking to this covenant, to this deep friendship, this deep love that they have for one another. He says, fine, whatever you say, let me do it. David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at table with the king. This is not a religious sitting at the table. It's not a commanded duty, but this is clearly something that happened regularly under Saul's kingship. There would be this feast, this festival of some sort at every new moon, where Saul would have his commanders, his servants, dine with him. But David says, let me go that I may hide myself in the field till the 3rd day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan. If he says, good, it will be well with your servant. But if he is angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father?" So David basically says, look, if I have done something wrong, you be the one to kill me. But look, we're in this covenant together, and I'm telling you that this is the issue, and I want you to go do this for me. Test and see if your father is actually angry with me or if he does have favor in my sight. And of course, we know how this is going to turn out. It's not going to turn out well. But 9 says, Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you?" Then David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me if your father answers you roughly?" And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out into the field." So they both went out into the field. And Jonathan said to David, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety." So again, this is oath language here. Jonathan is saying, if I don't tell you, if my father is angry at me and I don't tell you that he is, may the Lord do so to me. Whatever happens to you, may that same punishment happen to me, and even worse. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So again, we just see this deep friendship, this deep love that they have for one another, this covenant relationship where they're promising, we're going to look out for each other's children. And Jonathan basically is here saying, I know that you're the one who's going to take the throne. He doesn't flat out say it, but he does say, may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. He's expressing his blessing for David's kingship. Then Jonathan said to him, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. On the third day, go down quickly to the place where you hid yourself when the matter was in hand, and remain beside the stone heap. And I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it, as though I shot at a mark. And behold, I will send the young man, saying, Go, find the arrows. If I say to the young man, Look, the arrows are on this side of you, take them, then you are to come, for as the Lord lives, it is safe for you, and there is no danger. But if I say to the youth, Look, the arrows are beyond you, then go, for the Lord has sent you away. And as for the matter of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever. The Lord is between us. The Lord is always going to make sure that we have this friendship." So David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. The king sat on his seat, as at other times, on the seat by the wall. Jonathan sat opposite, and Abner sat by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Yet Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, something has happened to him. He is not clean, surely he is not clean. But on the second day, the day after the new moon, David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, Why has not the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today? So at first Saul thinks, well, perhaps David is just undergoing a period of ritual uncleanness. This could be like touching a dead body or any number of things from the Levitical code of the Torah that says, hey, when you do this, you're unclean. You got to be clean before you can engage with the rest of society. But then when the second day rolls around, he turns to Jonathan, to this friend of David, and says, well, where is he? What's up? Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go, for our clan holds a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. So now if I have found favor in your eyes, let me go away and see my brothers. For this reason he has not come to the king's table. Now there's an interesting excursus I suppose we could do here on lying. This is not the only time that we see a follower of Yahweh lying, either in the Old Testament. I don't have one coming to my mind off the top of my head in the New Testament. But we see it a couple times in the Old Testament where people are kind of demonstrated as faithful for not telling the truth. This is a really slippery slope, obviously, and I don't want to dwell too much on it. But I think there are times in life where I would maybe not say lying is the right option, but where if we were to speak the truth, we might be causing more harm than good. This is not something we do to protect ourselves. I want to make that perfectly clear. Every time we see it happening in the Old Testament, it's in order to protect someone else. Jonathan's protecting David. You can think of the Hebrew midwives in the book of Exodus. They're protecting those children who they were supposed to be killing. So I think as we think about this, this is maybe like the equivalent of a soldier not revealing or telling false information to his captors. I would not necessarily say that it's unsinful, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's sinful either. We do see God showing favor in at least the Hebrew midwives for sure. And I think Jonathan is portrayed in a very positive light here in how he's handling this. So the caveat here, I suppose, is maybe there are times where in order to protect others, we put ourselves at risk under God's law by telling a lie. That might be the best way to look at it. Is it still a sin? Perhaps. But maybe we're talking about like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer type thing where we figure this is the sin that we can live with rather than the sin of actually hurting someone else. Okay, sorry. Kind of a pointless excursus, but let's continue. Verse 30, Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. So Saul accuses Jonathan. He smells out this lie, and he basically says, look, clearly your mother must have slept with someone else. Clearly you are not my son. Clearly you are exposing your mother's nakedness. He's basically saying you are showing that your mother was immoral, that you are not truly my child, that you must be someone else's child, that I would not bear you, otherwise you would be looking out for me. Otherwise you would be siding with me rather than David. Go get him because he needs to die, otherwise your dynasty, my dynasty, they don't last. Then Jonathan answered Saul his father, Why should he be put to death? What has he done? But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. Saul hurls his spear at his own son to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. And so we see that Jonathan doesn't just hurt for himself here, although obviously he's been disgraced throughout this process as well. He hurts for his friend who has done nothing wrong and is yet being persecuted. I think here we see again a foreshadowing of a greater son of David, someone who truly would do no wrong ever in his life, and yet would be killed unjustly, would be persecuted. Praise be to God that it's through that persecution, through Jesus' suffering and death, that we receive forgiveness, that we receive life everlasting. Verse 35, In the morning Jonathan went out into the field to the appointment with David, and with him a little boy. You can see this image. I certainly picture this image fairly vividly, actually. You have David hiding in the rocks. I actually picture always kind of a taller field around him as well. But he's waiting to see what Jonathan is going to say. And he says to the boy, Run and find the arrows that I shoot. As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the boy came to the place of the arrow that Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the boy and said, Is not the arrow beyond you? So he gives the sign to David, You're going to have to run. You're going to have to flee. My father wants you dead, and I'm not going to be able to protect you. I'm not in his confidence in this regard. And Jonathan called after the boy, Hurry, be quick, do not stay. So Jonathan's boy gathered up the arrows and came to his master. But the boy knew nothing. The boy doesn't know why they're doing this. He's totally clueless. Only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his weapons to his boy and said to him, Go and carry them to the city. And as soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. David says, Jonathan, you are truly a king. You are truly royal. David right here is acknowledging Jonathan's royalty and saying, You deserve to be king. Look at what you're doing. You're protecting me even though you know that I'm in between you and the throne. Even though your father is against me, you love me and care for me. And they kissed one another. Again, some people will say clearly romantic. Most actually kissing that we see in the Old Testament is not romantic. There's only 3 exceptions to that. 1 in Proverbs, 2 in Song of Solomon. All other kisses that we see are between family members, between brothers or sons and fathers. Typically, it would have been a kiss on the neck is how they would have done this. And they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. David is just bitter with grief here because of the love of his friend. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, because we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. The rest of his life, David is going to be on the run. Or I should say, the rest of Saul's life, David is going to be on the run. He's going to be continually persecuted, hunted down, despite having done nothing wrong. And this is the second to last time that he will ever see this great friend. And I do find myself thinking of how right he is to weep here. Friendship is this great gift from God, and we should weep when that gift is taken away from us via death or a change of address or just kind of the passing of time. It's a sad thing. But David also still has his trust in the Lord. And we know that that is where our trust lies as well. And so I pray that you will continue to both nourish those friendships in your life, nourish those relationships so that you might have a love between you like David and Jonathan did. But also that we might continue to see first things first. And that we might see the friendship of God, God's love, God's care for us as an even greater love than any friend could possess. God's blessings to you this day, and I look forward to working through these next few chapters of Samuel as we dive into kind of David's journeys through the wilderness. Thanks. Have a good one.